Um, if this is your first visit to Science Gallery London, welcome. And I just want to spend a minute giving you a sense of what this place is and what we're trying to do. This comes out differently every time. What is it today? I mean, we're a part of King's College London, so we're a part of a university. I'm a member of university staff, and that's already quite a rare thing for a university to have this porous and edge to it. And one of the things we think about a lot as a team is, I mean, conceptually, you'd say there are rapid shifts in our technology and climate and identity and da-da-da. In practice, it feels to more and more of us like the world is metaphorically and literally on fire and scary and a difficult, messy, complicated place to live in. And one of the things that I think we personally and professionally feel hungry for is a kind of civic and social infrastructure where people get to try and make sense of it. And in practice, one of the things that we're trying to do, I keep saying trying because I feel like trying is what we're doing, is creating space for artists, scientists, academics, teachers, health workers, patients, poets, writers, policymakers, this breadth of people who are all staring at the same planet, but doing so from different angles. They're so often strangers. They're so often in different rooms, in different sectors, speaking different languages. And we're hungry for there to be more containers where they can spend a little bit of time together. Not to solve a thing or to do things that are too impossible to claim, but just to sort of shift each other's understanding, build slightly different languages, make the conversation a bit messier, and in practice, understand that there are different types of knowledge and they all are valid as expertise, whether it's academic or artistic. We've all got different ways of making sense of the world, and it's important to spend a bit of time together. And at the moment, what we're doing as a gallery is focusing a lens very keenly on AI. And this thing that can feel like a discrete, monolithic, sleek, distant thing that's happening to us is in practice a group of human beings, a set of specific contexts, value systems, imperatives, and the like. And if you get a chance, the exhibition upstairs is open till January the 20th, from Wednesday to Saturday. We'd love you to come and see it if you haven't already. But one of the things that's most exciting has been the events program. And I was sitting in, just eavesdropping in the green room for 5 minutes earlier and listening to Sanjay and Rachel and Jennifer talking, and just my hope, having heard that snippet, is what you'll encounter tonight is an embodiment of some of that messy hybrid set of perspectives that complicate a thing that all too often feels very, very, distant. Anyway, that is probably more than enough from me, and it's a very long-winded welcome. I'm just going to say very quick thank yous. It should be Jen Wong, who's our head of programming, speaking right now, but we've got another event upstairs right at the same minute, so she's up there. But Jen, our head of programming, has done so much, more than anyone in the building, to shape this season. Andrew Starks is operating about 17 machines at once to sort of make the audio and visuals work. Rashid Rahman's our marketing comms lead, and if you're online, you're meeting him. If you're here, you've met his work because you found your way here. And last but not least, Carol Keating, who's the producer for this event and has been a star. So yes, thank you very, very much. I'm going to hand over to Sanjay and the panel. Cheers.
Thank you, Siddharth.
Thank you. Very kind.
So welcome to you all here in person at King's College London, and for those joining online, so welcome to the Science Gallery. Before I begin, can I just quick show of hands, how many of you are involved in AI in some way, either in development or in an AI adjacent area, just to get a feel? Great, thank you. So, well, we're all here because, of course, the coming age of artificial intelligence is set to dwarf the transformative impact of earlier technological revolutions. And that's largely, I think, because, of course, the technology of AI is intelligence itself. So in the past, we humans have used our intelligence to create tools for our use. The tools we are creating are themselves going to be intelligent. And so that points to some of the transformative impact. And of course, But the potential benefits are enormous, from revolutionizing healthcare to maybe enabling the green energy transition, revolutionizing productivity in the workplace. But of course, there are some risks, short-term and long-term. We've already seen these large language models concern about ChatGPT. Maybe there are longer-term risks, worries about AI acting in ways that are kind of misaligned with some of our most cherished values. So to prepare ourselves for this kind of coming revolution, as many of you have probably heard, there are a bunch of very important people meeting at this very moment in Bletchley Park at the UK AI Summit. And so this panel is really convened to sort of think about some of the issues that they might be thinking about. And hopefully maybe we can make, with enough of these events, we can have a voice in the conversation and include you all, in the public, in the conversation. Because after all, AI will impact on your lives and future generations. So let me introduce my panelists. First, we have Jennifer Beroshi, who is Head of Policy, Strategy and Development at Google DeepMind. Google DeepMind, as many of you know, is an AI company that was initially born here in the UK and has been taken over, but in a very friendly way, by Google. We have Rachel Coldicutt, who is a technology strategist and founder of the independent research studio and social enterprise Careful Trouble. And joining us online from Kenya, Rachel Adams, a lead on responsible AI at Kenya-based think tank, Research ICT Africa. So let's welcome our panel members. So a question to all of you, maybe just first of all, just to introduce yourself, what you do and your interests and particular relevance to some of the topics we'll be talking about today. And then maybe perhaps if each of you could just briefly describe sort of one ethical issue or concern that you have about AI. So perhaps I can start with you, Jennifer.
Great. Thank you for having us here. And as you just heard, I'm Jen, and I work at Google DeepMind, and we're based not far from here up in King's Cross. And my role on the public policy team at DeepMind, I would describe as having a bit of a dual orientation. Part of it is working with policy stakeholders, the policy community, and that includes governments, but also civil society, developing materials, positions, thinking that helps make sure that we are really bringing AI into the world in a way that is safe and responsible. But then the second part of the role is also working very closely with a lot of internal teams at the company to make sure that we are indeed building our technology in a way that is safe and responsible, so bringing those insights back in. And I have been at Google DeepMind for 4 years. Before that, I was in the broader Google company for 7 years. It's been a long time. I've basically spent the past 13 years working on technology and digital policy in a range of different countries. And I would say that has made me interested in the global impact of technology, and it is bolstered by the fact that I am originally from Mexico. So I really like to think about how do we make sure, again, that we're talking about these technologies. They're not only, again, good, but they're good really including for all types of communities and all types of people who you might not usually think about. And as you might imagine, from someone who has had this career, I am fundamentally very optimistic about the role that AI can ultimately have in society, but I also think it is very important for us to be thinking about the risks and making sure that we are stress testing what we do as much as possible, and really thinking ahead, right? Exercising that responsibility to think ahead and really manifesting some of, again, the lessons that we've learned from the rollouts of other technologies and the impacts we've seen them had in society. So I will, I'll cheat a little bit. I think we need to think about all types of ethical concerns, the ones that we call near term, the ones that we call longer term. And they range from things like AI systems that could be showing us biased content when we go and we interact with a chatbot on the internet, all the way through to things that might only really come about as the technology gets more powerful. And you see them doing things like producing information that might not be genuine on a scale that really becomes quite destabilizing for society. And again, I think it is our responsibility to be thinking ahead about that full spectrum of potential risks, just in the way that I like to think about the full spectrum of potential opportunities.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to ask Rachel C. So I'm going to use the terms Rachel C and Rachel A because we have two Rachels, so to make sure there's no confusion. So Rachel C, maybe you'd like to say a little bit about yourself.
Hi. So I have been working on the internet for a long time, since about 1996, when it wasn't really thought to be like a proper job, really, you know. And because of that, I've sort of accidentally worked in R&D because I've worked on lots of things that have never happened before as they've happened for the first time. And I spent probably just over 20 years making products and websites and those kinds of things, and have been working in policy latterly. And it's very unusual to get a person working in policy who's made things. Normally, people who work in policy have read a lot about things or researched a lot of people. And I think one of the things that's very interesting about AI, and I'll explain slightly more about what it is I do in a moment, is that there's a lot of mystery about it. And I think if there's like the thing that I'm concerned about is power, because there's a lot of terms that are used that are difficult to understand. There's a lot of money that moves around. There's a lot of influence, and that AI is all sorts of things. It isn't even a technology. It's dozens and dozens of things, and we encounter it in all sorts of different ways. But I think it's being weaponized as an idea, and I think it's being turned into something that is considered to be somehow more powerful than democracy, more powerful than the rule of law. And I think that is a problem. So the work I do has like two halves. I used to do a lot of government policy work, and I stopped doing that in about 2019 because it didn't feel to me like it was an environment in which I wanted to work. And what I do a bit more of now is, on the one hand, a little bit of organising and agitating on the outside, but my team who I work with, we do two different things. On the one hand, we do research and foresight, so we work with governments all over the world and corporates and health organisations and things to help them understand what is likely to happen in the future, and to do that more ethically. And then we do very practical, on-the-ground prototyping and piloting to show how it could be. Because I think it's very easy to talk the talk, but much harder to make things. And so I think there's been it's really a fascinating moment to have something that I've been working on for such a long time now be suddenly splashed all over the sun, you know, as you walk into the supermarket. And the idea of what these words and these ideas turn into in the public imagination is quite different maybe to what they really are. And so maybe that seems a bit abstract, but I think if there's a thing I'm concerned about, it's power rather than tech itself.
Thank you, Rachel. And I suppose following on, I mean, education, educating the public on what these terms mean, making sure that is that something you see as?
I mean, I think the most important thing is for people not to be ridiculous, you know. And so I think, right, so there's an extent to which, right, as a member of the society now, you're expected to have media literacy, data literacy, statistical literacy. You're expected to be able to differentiate between a fake and a genuine bit of information. And actually, really, that is structural power being exerted on us to make it impossible to live our lives. We deserve to live in navigable, understandable systems that we can bring our kind of whole self to understand. And I think, you know, if going about one's daily life requires a PhD, I think that's probably an issue. So I think education, yes, but actually transparency, honesty, being candid is probably more important.
Thank you. Thank you. Rachel A. there in Kenya. Hello. Maybe you can say something a bit about yourself and some of the issues you are dealing with.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. And it's such a pleasure to be here. I'm joining you from Cape Town, not Nairobi. So just to make sure that we're being candid and transparent about where I'm based. So my work, I have a background in human rights. And I have been working for a number of years across what we could call the responsible AI ecosystem on the African continent. So this involves working with African policymakers to think about what are the particular kinds of policy responses and regulatory needs that might be needed in quite different African countries to ensure that AI does not harm societies and is used to help solve developmental challenges is what the kind of big promise is. But more recently, what work I've been doing, which I've been finding really, really interesting, is working with a cohort of data entrepreneurs and researchers, particularly in the African continent, but across what we might call the global south or majority world, to use generative AI technologies like ChatGPT to assess the degree to which they can be used to help solve some of the kind of big ticket developmental challenges. So one such project is using a ChatGPT like it's an application that you would download onto your phone, and it overlays ChatGPT, and it's for women who are victims of domestic violence, who face enormous stigmatization if and when they approach the formal institutions in South Africa. And this chatbot provides legal advice to help women navigate through this system. Another one is for adolescents who might be based in a rural community in India or in Nigeria, where again, there's a lot of stigma to asking questions about sexual and reproductive health. And there's chatbot type applications that are using generative AI, natural language processing, to provide sensitive, culturally appropriate, as far as possible, advice to adolescents on how to deal with different kinds of sexual and reproductive health issues. So these are very nascent and emerging, and there's a lot of potential problems associated with this, potential risks. But I think these are really exciting stories that showcase a different kind of way in which artificial intelligence can be used. So, Sanjay, to answer your question, my big worry is that artificial intelligence is worsening global inequality in a really major way. So Rachel spoke about money, and Sanjay, you spoke about productivity. When ChatGPT came out and frontier technologies and generative AI, there was a new report from McKinsey to do a new kind of estimate on what would be the contribution that these new technologies would make to the global economy. It was pegged at $25 trillion, which is the size of the US economy, the world's largest economy. That is massive. But the African continent has not seen a significant increase to GDP from the internet. What makes us assume it's going to see a significant economic benefit from artificial intelligence? It's really not. And so I'm interested in this kind of stage in which we're at, where the reality is that AI has not been designed for communities outside of particular Western contexts and are not serving communities everywhere. And I think there's an interesting conversation we can have here about how the degree to which these technologies are even serving all communities in Western contexts. But I think that AI still holds this transformative potential, which I still remain excited by and interested in. But the inequality is the greatest threat to the degree to which that transformative potential can be realized. And I feel that we're at a kind of watershed moment where we suddenly have everybody interested in what this technology can do. And I think that's an important time to think about how do we want to shift the conversation around how these technologies need to be designed and for whom, and how we want to ensure the distribution of these benefits and what that looks like and what kind of work that entails. So thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. So some of the issues you've all referred to, I mean, perhaps can be to some extent addressed by regulation. And we have some means of regulating AI, but there are significant gaps. And so we've seen proposals from the UK which are saying, well, look, existing regulatory bodies can handle this. The EU Act, which is focusing on existing high-risk systems. The US has an AI Bill of Rights. But looking forward, I think the UK AI Summit, the idea is to kind of bring recommendations that can help evolve these regulatory frameworks. So in some sense, related to some of the concerns you've already expressed, what would you hope, what recommendations would you hope would come out of the UK Summit that's currently taking place? And maybe we can start again with you, Jennifer.
Sure, and I think you just touched on a very important point, which is that AI is already, and we should ensure that it is recognized that it is highly regulated. So again, you have all of these existing laws that apply in every domain of our life. And just because something around us is done using AI does not mean that it's magically exempted from that regulation. So again, if AI is being misused in something like a medical application, the usual regulation, which is quite stringent for medical devices, applies. And I actually think that here in the UK, the MHRA has done a great job of setting out very clearly, again, it's like they've set out very clearly the usual regulations still apply. Again, like the US also has a number of agencies that have done that. Like there's no magic wand where someone gets to say like, oh, but it's because it's this magic technology that we were not subject to, again, all of the other, say, requirements around equitable outcomes or safe outcomes, again, that you get in some of these domains. That said, it is, again, I think all of us will be keenly aware there's a flurry of activity, and we were discussing how every day there seems to be a new proposal, new measures around AI and how do we deal with them. And you have some proposals like the one the EU has put out, which at least originally was very focused on specific areas of application. And they said these are the domains where we think the use of AI is particularly high risk, and therefore we will have requirements, again, for high risk applications. You have some other proposals that have taken different tacks. And one of the things that you see emerging now as a trend is are these conversations around safeguards that we should have. Again, kind of perhaps, again, regardless of the use of specific applications, what are some guardrails that we want to make sure that we build in really at kind of the core technology, the model level, in view of the fact that they could be used in so many different potential applications. So really looking at that as a way that you really get kind of scalable safeguards on these systems. And I think that's a lot of what the conversation at the AI Safety Summit that's occurring today and tomorrow is kind of focused about, and it's about building that preparedness for the future risks. And again, what I think is important is I think it's valuable that you are having different conversations that focus on different things, because what we are going to need is this full spectrum regulatory approach where you know that some of the uses of AI that could be having negative impacts on people today, there is a way to address that, but that you are also building systems that can address some of the ones that fall into edge cases that we haven't necessarily thought of yet. And again, that's part of what the summit is aiming to do. One of the things that I think would be really valuable for them to do, which I understand is in their ambitions, is actually to commission a joint report from scientists about how they view the capabilities of AI systems at large and their resulting risks. And again, of course, that's already the subject of conversations at the summit, but I think it is really nice when you get scientists, independent scientists who contribute their views and really take the time to lay out and document that in the report. And I do think you do need this baseline of global understanding. Again, like you need some agreement about what we are talking about here so that you can have then those concrete conversations about what do we do about it, both to limit the risks, but also, again, like really work on delivery mechanisms, again, around the world. Because I think the points that were made earlier are absolutely right, that part of what you need is you also need effort to ensure that AI is actually benefiting communities everywhere. That doesn't just happen magically. And there should also be accountability and resourcing around that. So that's just some thoughts from me.
Thank you, Jennifer. Rachel A, in response to that, what would you like to see come out of the summit? What recommendations, concrete or sort of more general, in terms of what you were talking about earlier as well?
Yeah, thank you. I think to start with, the UK needs to use its convening power to convene meaningful international committees to be involved in some of the kind of agenda setting work around artificial intelligence. It's not enough to have Kenya and Nigeria in the room. There's 54 African states. The Comoros is doing really interesting stuff. Senegal's doing really interesting stuff. So I think it's very easy. I worry that sometimes it becomes a kind of tick box. Okay, we have one African country, two African countries in the room, therefore the continent as a whole is represented. That's really, really not the case. I think in terms of what kind of new ideas around how we can kind of regulate or move forward in a way that advances the kind of positive change we need to see, I'm not seeing enough on labour. Some of the labour questions, both for people who are whose work is managed by AI or who are involved in the AI value chain and life cycle, this seems to be considered a side issue that's not integral to AI regulation or where we think about AI harms. And there's a lot of harms occurring there. And I think there's major societal impacts happening in the global division of labour and labour more generally, where digital labour becomes very isolated and the ways in which you can advance collective action become less and less easy to do. So I think we need to be thinking carefully around how do we protect collective bargaining rights and trade unions in quite a different working space when it comes to AI. I think that's important from a political perspective. I think it's important from some of the concerns that Rachel has raised around power. The other thing that I'm not seeing generally is a focus on women. It is not coming out strongly enough at all. There's a lot of kind of talk about the bias that AI can have that's gendered, that's racial, and in other ways, and that's really, really important. But we also need to look at how do we empower women and women's voices to be at the forefront of this movement. And that becomes particularly important in the development space, which I work in, where we have a history of seeing how women's leadership has produced results that are more beneficial for society. And this is an industry that is really led by men. And I think when it's led by men in a kind of very narrow sense of the term, I'm talking in binaries here, and I don't mean that in an essentializing way, but I think that we lose sight of some of the kind of breadth of what this technology needs to do and needs to fit in with in a kind of broader sense within society. And then lastly, just to say on the kind of question around regulation, yes, we have a lot. And one of the pieces of work I'm doing is a global study on where very different countries are at around the world in terms of implementing principles around responsible AI. But in the African context, we don't have the same degree of oversight institutions that enable another layer of safeguarding for these technologies, which means that we're relying entirely on the good design of tech by big tech companies that are not designing the technologies for African communities and societies. So there's a real tension there. But I'll pause here. Thanks, Sanjay.
Thank you, Rachel. Actually, one point you mentioned was about people working like in the AI industry, and I recall sort of concerns about sort of quite cheap labour, as it were, being used to sort of trawl through sort of offensive material, and their role was to sort of filter out the offensive material, and the effect that was having on the mental health of these people who were just like spending the whole day just being exposed to the most awful material. Is that something that you've been sort of focusing on as well in your work?
Yeah, it's been something that that has come up as a really critical issue facing people that are in positions where they're vulnerable to needing to make a living, and so they have to take whatever kind of work is available. And Sanjay, I think you've described it very, very well. But it's not always kind of combing through very offensive images. It can also be just kind of mind-numbing work where you're labeling the same kind of object from many different angles again and again for months and months on end. So yes, that kind of work environment is not the kind of dignified work that I think we want to be creating. But there are other issues that come alongside that. So this is part of this kind of extended supply chain of artificial intelligence, where it's not Meta or Google that are employing directly some kind of data labeling company that then sets up an office in Kenya. There's quite a kind of protracted, quite complex supply chain. And then these companies come in very temporary ways, so they don't set up industries. I mean, this particular office that I think you're speaking about was in Nairobi. They don't set up offices where you're setting up infrastructure that means you're growing an industry in a country where there might then become kind of economic benefit. Everything is temporary office space. You're giving people sort of 1 month contract. People also don't know what they're doing the work for, so there's no kind of greater sense of the meaning behind what their work is contributing to. So I think there's a kind of layer upon layer of dehumanizing attributes that come to make up what this kind of work involves.
Thank you, Rachel. Rachel, do you want to speak to what you might like to see come out of the summit?
I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting, just to pick up on your point, it seems odd to me to begin from the perspective of what can the technology do. I think we should begin from the perspective of what kind of society do we want, and what do we ask of our technologies and the people who are making them. And the fact that so often it's turned around, I think, means that we're operating in the wrong frame. And so, I don't know, are there any regulatory nerds here? Two, amazing. Right, so the thing is there's kind of two different ways broadly of regulating. So there's regulating through standards and principles and saying how you would like things to be. And then there is regulating after things have happened, broadly, right? And what tends to happen with tech is we quite often end up regulating after the fact. And so we wait for something to have emerged to such an extent that it is clearly harmful at a scale and is prevalent, and then we try to put it back in the box. And that doesn't really work. And there's a real nervousness about moving towards regulatory approaches that talk about rights, for instance, as opposed to risk. And as you said, last year in the US, what's called the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights was published, which is one of the most significant, I think, rights-based approaches that there is. Because, you know, I gave a talk in Oxford about a week and a half ago, and I was talking about how really all the technologies we're making need to be rights respecting. And somebody afterwards put their hand up and asked me a question, which the more I think about it, just the more extraordinary it seems to me, which is, which human rights do AI developers need to protect? It's like, what? All of them, right? It's not like...
You don't pick and choose.
Yeah, you don't like choose. And so, you know, the thing that I would really like to see is, rather than this idea that we're going to write a long list of every risk that could ever happen and then try and legislate for each of those risks in different ways and come up with mechanisms, is that we apply the, you know, existing human rights frameworks, the existing legal approaches to create technologies that work for more people. Because I think a risk-based approach gives the power to the people who are speculating on what might happen. You know, and so I think there's a whole other thing, you know, to talk about around existential risk. But rather more boringly, like, has anybody here followed the online safety bill? Amazing. I mean, home crowd, that was like 5 people. So the online safety bill is now an act. It became law this week. It has taken 5.5 years to go through. And one of the reasons it's taken 5.5 years is because, for a reason that escapes me, someone decided what they were going to do is make a list of everything that might go wrong on every social media platform, which means that the minute the list is made, it's out of date. And it includes extraordinary things, like, so there's a provision in there for skirting and another for down blousing, not just all photography that is invasive, right? And I think the things that I would like to see are, rather than overly technical, overly analytical new frameworks, I would like to see a recognition that even Silicon Valley billionaires have to operate within the frame of functioning democratic societies. And it feels to me, you know, if there's something I would like to happen, I would like Elon Musk not to be turning up and turning it into a clown show. Because I think even that just makes it clear it is not serious. It is not a serious consideration of rights. It is a playground for billionaires, which I think is a real shame.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, following off one of your points, I mean, we're seeing these large language models like ChatGPT. If we feel like we're in the midst of a mass experiment, basically, sort of let them loose, see how society copes. And then, but what you were suggesting is, well, then it's too late to put the lid back on Pandora's box, and that they should be designed from the outset, not to have the kind of impacts like misinformation or the spread of information, the generation of fake news that we will witness down the line and very shortly. Okay, so thank you for that. Actually, following on from mention of our mutual friend Elon Musk, I say this with a certain amount of irony. I mean, part of, I think, the issue that he can generate so much news, perhaps because of his flippancy and the fact that he doesn't seem to be taking things that seriously. But that points to who has been invited to the UK summit. So there is some criticism of maybe people and states that have been invited, like Elon Musk, like China, who might not have the best interests of people at heart. Jennifer, do you think it's right to include a broad international spectrum of countries, including countries like China and individuals like Elon Musk?
Yeah, I think when we say that we want to have a broad, global, and inclusive debate, that does raise these, it's easy to say that, but it does raise these tricky questions, which is like, okay, at some point you're going to actually be talking about people, countries, governments, individuals that you disagree with. My view is that you still need to talk to them, at least when you're dealing, if you're going to be serious about these things, like the safety of systems that you're going to be deploying at a global scale, you do need to talk to them, because there's no point in developing a norm that only applies in some countries, and then you have some of the leading developers in China that just don't respect those same norms and don't have the same, say for example, emergency protocols or things that you want to design. Again, you should recognize the fact, again, when you're having those conversations, that there are different mindsets about, and different degrees of democratic oversight that then are represented, right? Because again, it is easy to say there are some countries where we have more confidence that the norms will be informed by governments that do have that democratic oversight and others not. But again, I do think that there is that uncomfortable point where there are certain topics where you do want to keep those conversations open when you're talking about such an important topic. I do think, of course, then there's the question of, okay, but how do you present it, right? Like, I think that how do you manage these conversations so that they just don't take up all of the air in the room and distract from what should be really valuable, substantive conversations? And that's again, I think it'll remain to be seen how some of those elements are managed.
Do you think that so I don't know if some of you know, but maybe you mentioned there's a Bletchley Park declaration that came out lunchtime with signatories from different countries across the globe. Does that give you grounds for optimism in going forward?
I think so. And actually, all right, if you ask me about grounds for optimism, I will say this. I do think that there's reason to be optimistic about the declaration, the communique, however they've been calling it, where they basically got a number of countries who were represented at the summit to at least agree on, I will say it's not something incredibly sophisticated, but they say this is the reason why we're here today, and we agree that AI has promise, and we also agree that it raises risks, and here are some of these risks. And we then agree that we're going to work on that together. And I think it's a good thing, and I think it's a good thing to see a range of countries that are represented there. Could it be broader? Should it be broader? Yes. Again, the answer is yes. But again, I think that it's very easy, and again, I think sometimes I fall into this trap. It's easy to get cynical about policymaking processes and to think, oh, but nothing moves these days. But the truth is, right? And sometimes you're like, there's a bill like the online safety bill, and it takes 5 years. And the truth is, you're seeing a lot of action on AI. You're seeing so much activity where people said, oh, but countries don't talk to each other and they don't agree things. And again, we have been struggling to keep up with the number of things that countries in various configurations have now agreed on, from a G7 code of conduct over the course of the weekend. Again, the US, everyone says the US doesn't pass any laws. They actually just issued a 110 plus page executive order that in large part directs agencies to go and put into motion things to make alive the Bill of Rights, the AI Bill of Rights that you were just mentioning, Rachel. So again, a lot of those things are happening, and again, I think it's easy to get overwhelmed by them, but I think there's also something to be optimistic about there, where it's like, okay, but you are seeing agreement and movement at a time when, as we all know, it feels like a little bit of a grim time internationally, and a grim time for institutions. So I draw some hope there.
Yeah, and I believe they've pledged 2 more follow-up summits, right? So one in Korea, I think the next one in Korea, and then in France.
Korea and then Paris. I know, and at the it's sounding a little bit now like the Olympics or World Cup, like AI, like holiday.
And they'll be bidding.
Exactly.
They'll be bidding for rights to host.
Yeah, and exactly. And again, I think there's a question of, I think it's ambitious. I think it takes a lot of work to pull together these summits, as we have seen, and doing one every 6 months that will be effective is very ambitious. But I think it's a good thing to keep this alive, right? To say like it wasn't just a one-time thing that we did because it would be flashy. I think that's something that seems to me a good outcome.
Thank you. Rachel A. So, we've been talking about regulation, and you, of course, mentioned the issue of sort of having a more kind of inclusive role for people from different parts of the world, different cultures. And it's kind of interesting. So I mentioned earlier, so the UK, the EU, and the US proposals, but actually there are other substantive proposals, in particular the UNESCO 2021 recommendation on ethics in AI, and I believe also you were telling me about the Global Index on Responsible AI. Now, these initiatives, I think, are not getting as much media attention, and maybe that's because they're not Western-centric and Western-led. I mean, maybe you might want to talk about, say something about those, and are you hoping that there will be more kind of inclusion of different voices as we go forward in shaping the regulatory landscape?
Yes, thank you very much, Sanjay. Look, I think we have to recognize that we desperately need international cooperation in this space. So, for example, with the kind of labor-related harms that we might see in Kenya or other parts of the world where these industries, data labeling industries, are being set up, they're not going to be solved through Kenya developing a really good Labor Relations Act. These are global issues that need global cooperation to address. And I think the redistributive potential, which I really would like to see more of, is inherently going to require international cooperation. But then I think we get to the fact that values and ethical principles and ethics look different for different people in different parts of the world. We do not all have the same values that we believe are at risk by artificial intelligence. So I think this is where a human rights framework is important, because we have long ago agreed on a set of fundamental human rights that we do not want to jeopardize or risk in any future scenario with any kind of future technology coming on board. So this is where both the Global Index that I'm leading and the UNESCO recommendation on ethics in AI is quite important. So the UNESCO recommendation on ethics in AI was signed by 103 member states of UNESCO. US was not part of UNESCO at that point in time. It is now. So that was important, and there was a long consultative process that involved as many countries as they could, including small island states. So it really was developed from this kind of very wide cultural and social perspective. And it has as its first value, it's structured four values, 10 principles, and then 11 policy areas. The first value is protection of all human rights, protection, respect, and respect for all human rights and promotion. So the Global Index on Responsible AI takes the UNESCO principles and other principles, but pits them alongside our established canon of human rights, which include not just what we might traditionally call first generation rights, which are the right to privacy, to freedom of expression, access to information, which are broadly considered kind of individual rights, but also socioeconomic rights like right to housing, right to water, right to education, right to health, where AI is not just being used to control and provide access to these rights, but where AI may have a fundamentally transformative impact. We know this from some of the AlphaFold work going on with Google DeepMind, for example. So we're looking at these rights together with environmental rights, rights of future generations, labor rights, and collective and community rights, and established a broad measurement framework to measure the extent to which countries around the world are implementing what we might call sort of responsible AI principles and standards that, as I said, are human rights based. And that we've just completed the pilot in 10 countries, and we've begun data collection this week. And it's incredible doing a project like this where we have researchers in almost every single country in the world, and the kind of geopolitical crisis that we have that's facing us at the moment is I think it's just a really kind of important and interesting and critical space in which to be thinking about international cooperation, and we really need to be doing that in very reflective and careful ways, including interrogating what the UK's intention is in bringing together international stakeholders to sign some kind of declaration. I think the content of the declaration, I think it's valuable, I really do. But the UK is not the United Nations. So on what merit and power is it saying we have the power to convene and speak for people around the world? And in some ways, it can be a good thing. It can be, okay, we have the power, we're going to open doors to create more inclusivity and diversity in this space. But we need to be critical and questioning here, I think.
Some people would say that the UK are pitching themselves as a sort of middleman or woman between the US and China. But of course, others, cynics, might say, well, Rishi Sunak's interested in leaving a legacy. So, well, that's open for discussion and debate. But coming actually to your point, I mean, you've stressed this, and I think this has been coming across, the sort of the impact on AI on society at large, and it's quite transformative, all aspects of human experience. I mean, with that in mind, Rachel, are you, I mean, you've expressed concerns about who's being represented in these regulatory bodies or even in shaping regulation. Do you want to say something more about who you think should be more represented in these kinds of arenas?
I mean, I suppose just to pick up on Rachel's point, you know, I think I am a terrible cynic, and, you know, I think that Sunak is lining up his next job, because hopefully he will need one soon. And that, you know, we're in a position where domestically we do not have our ducks in a row here. And so the idea that the UK might be a global standard setter or arbiter, it doesn't really make any sense, you know. And so I think it's a soft power move, not a technocratic move, you know. And I think we need to view it as such. And I think in terms of who needs to be represented, you know, there's something about, like, when we think about AI as a monolith, as like a big abstract thing, I think it's quite easy to then be thinking about the most extreme uses. But actually, you know, can we be thinking about the everyday? Can we be thinking about the administrative and service and the jobs that are being changed? Can we think about what it means to be educated, what it means for accountants and lawyers, what it means for justice, therefore, right? What it means at borders. And that actually, the people who experience harm very often are the people who are not listened to, and that those harms emerge in the cracks. You know, it's not like. So this week, I think, God, it feels like a long week. What day is it today? Is it Wednesday?
Wednesday.
Okay, so on Monday, a member of the government announced that they wanted to see police forces use facial recognition technologies 3 times more than they are at the moment. Now, facial recognition technologies don't really work, and they certainly don't work if you are not a white man. And the failover rates, I think, are incredibly high. And so wanting to use that technology more is not aligning yourself with justice. It's aligning yourself with, I don't know, maybe a flashy announcement. Maybe there was a memo that went round on Monday morning to say every department needs to have an AI thing this week, right? And so really the people who we need to be talking to and listening to are the people who are likely to be to be wrongly arrested, to be wrongly profiled. But actually, the way, you know, in a technical deployment scenario, they're the people who are going to be asked last. And so one of the things I think is really important is that civil society, by which I mean campaigners and activists, people working in communities on the ground, rather than passing the load every time to people who are experiencing harm, that actually there are these intermediary bodies who can see things happening. They're like sensing bodies. Like, if you want to know where the poorest people live in your neighbourhood, talk to the people at the food bank, right? They're the people on the ground who are dealing with the issues. And I think that if we don't involve civil society, if we involve Elon Musk, but not people who are representing the people who are the most vulnerable and minoritized, then actually it won't work. And so I think, of course, you can never have a meeting of 100 people that will be representative. But I think, for me, what that means is a meeting of 100 people is not the right mechanism. It's the thing that governments know how to do. And that actually, you know, and even, like, I mean, I don't know how many of us are here now. Is this about 100? About 100 people? Don't know. Right. So imagine if we spent 2 days trying to talk about some big issues. We probably wouldn't resolve it, right? There would be a lot of like agenda management and, you know, it's all theatre, right? It's not really a real thing that's happening. And so I think maybe that theatre can carry on and be programmed around the world, and people can have lovely holidays off the back of it, or whatever happens. But actually, we need, you know, continual holding to account, and we need mechanisms where we're all supporting and lifting up the people who are the least believed, the least supported, you know, and that actually, if technologies were able to help us with that, I'd be much more on board, I think.
Thank you, thank you. So we're going to maybe move to questions in a short while, but I thought maybe just sort of end with another sort of discussion. I mean, in particular, so the AI summit, this UK summit, has kind of been, a lot of the focus has been on this long-term, I mean, existential risks. So you hear about these titans of industry, and not just industry leaders, but academics, researchers, talking about long-term existential risks. And I think an interesting feature, Jennifer, is that, of course, the co-founders of the company you work with, Google DeepMind, Demis Habibs, excuse my pronunciation, I knew I'd get that wrong, and Mustafa Suleiman, themselves have been very vocal in warning about the long-term existential threats, and actually asking for regulation to preempt these kinds of threats, which is kind of unusual that the companies that are making these systems are actually saying, we need to worry about the long-term impacts of these systems, regulate us. What sort of initiative, I mean, how is Google DeepMind, what kind of initiatives have they in place to kind of address these long-term concerns?
Yes, and the way that we think about it is that we need to have the internal infrastructure to really be doing the diligence that we need, again, around all types of risks. And we do have all of these measures, and we have teams that are looking at things like, for example, our systems, when they're being integrated into an application, right? Like, are they showing biased results? And that could be very harmful to people. Are they producing toxic language? You know, are they producing all of these different types of things that we don't want them to do? And that's important. And I would say, in many ways, actually, we already, I think we're making really good progress just on having ways to evaluate and measure the ways that AI systems perform on those types of metrics, and we need to do better. But again, like that's already more established, and in large part because we have many years of digital, again, tech debate, tech policy debate to build on, right? Like the social media debate, the way that has evolved. And really what we have now is we do have leaders at the company and a lot of people at the company who really are thinking about this question of, okay, and building on that, what are the additional things that we need, again, just like to build, you know, the things that people will need to trust the technology. And again, there's a recognition that like you want people to trust the technology, you don't want them to be scared. And part of what it takes for people not to be scared is to really convince them that there's, again, this assurance, there's a process, right, to verify that technologies will be safe. We don't have that right now. There's no mechanism to be like, this is safe, but we should be trying to aim at something like that, and hence this conversation. And sometimes people say, well, but you know, it's speculative. But you're like, yeah, but you know, but at the same time, we also say we want to act before it's too late. So at some point, right, you need to start to get people to think about, you know, some of these things, like we should be addressing these risks. And then there are longer tail risks, and they're less probable. But even if they are a little bit probable, we should be approaching with caution. And I think that that's a responsibility that, again, just is felt heavily, certainly among the people that I work with, right? And in some ways, part of the value of a lot of events, again, like the summit and these discussions, is just like, you know, you just put it on the radar, that like that's something that you should be, again, addressing. And again, we're not saying it's likely that there's going to be existential risk, because again, all of us in the industry, if we were saying it's likely, again, we wouldn't be building a thing that we think is likely to be catastrophic. But it's a precautionary principle, and that's slightly different, right, from the things that you know we've seen before. But I think a lot of us, and again, I've spent years in the industry, I think a lot of us care deeply about applying lessons that we have learned from seeing sometimes how these systems grow and have impact globally, and then just saying, okay, but we can learn from what we've seen and apply that. And I'll just, you know, I think maybe my closing comment can be to say that I actually completely agree, Rachel, with your comments about, you know, we need to find ways to get that broader participation and that broader input, and we need to get creative about it. And sometimes, you know, and some of it means being creative with our institutions, and some of it can be trying to be creative with how we use technology, again, to get people's point of view, to inform the development and the regulation. A lot of that will be simply demystifying, and we opened with some comments around how it's so valuable just to, again, demystify what it is. And I actually think that what the Science Gallery is doing, organizations like this are doing, just in having exhibits, again, that allow people to engage with what AI is in creative ways, even that is so valuable. All of these things have that type of role. But I agree that should be certainly a high priority, which is how do we really make sure that the people who are affected are really finding ways to contribute to the debate.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there is a concern, I mean, that you alluded to this, that people, when you talk about existential risk, you know, people think about killer robots and stuff of sci-fi, whereas I think there are kind of other more sort of, as it were, subtle, but still significant existential risks, like, for example, the pollution of the information ecology by misinformation, you know, AI-generated misinformation. And if we can't agree on the facts, how can we agree on collective action to address some of the other existential risks that we are already facing, like climate change? And I think on that point, Rachel, do you see AI as potentially being able to help us transition to a kind of net zero green economy, or are we seeing are there hidden costs to the uses of AI in terms of the impact on the planet and climate change?
So, you know, I think any technology could or should be regarded as a tool to do the things that we think are important. But we're sort of in a place with AI at the moment where maybe, you know, the paradigm is more AI is doing things to us than we are doing with it. And there's something about, I think there's sometimes a very like mythical horizon on which AI discourse happens. So, you know, the idea that AI might, in the future, create the means for a net zero economy is a hope, right? It's not proven, it's a hope. It's maybe not that different to the hope, the speculation that AI might bring about the end of life on Earth, right? What we do know, for instance, is that the technologies that we use now and that we have now generate a huge amount of waste that we don't know how to process. We know that mining of materials is extractive, and we know that a lot of that is hidden from most of us as consumers. The data centers, huge amounts of water and energy. And of course, this might all turn out to be something that fixes something further down the line, or it might not. So I was saying earlier, there are 4 boroughs in West London who are not going to build any more houses for the next 10 years because the data centres are using too much water. But we don't really talk about that. We talk about there being an prize to do a thing that no one's thought of yet, And I think what this comes back to is a little bit like I think there's something really interesting, just to loop that back into the existential threat thing. So if like a load of guys turned up at Bletchley Park, because they are mostly men, tomorrow, and said, we think that the second coming is likely to happen, and we've been working really hard for this. We don't have any evidence, but we really believe it a lot, right? People would laugh at them. But when people who are either good at maths or have lots of money say those things, people think it's possible, right? And I don't know if it's because most of us aren't good at maths or have lots of money, and so we put those people in positions of power, right? But I think there's something about what are the narratives of hope that we need. And I think one of the reasons AI becomes very compelling is because we are living in kind of fairly hopeless, difficult times. And so we're looking for things to attach to. But, there's lots of very practical, on-the-ground things that we can do about, say, moving towards net zero. But maybe we don't want to do those because they don't feel as hopeful as using AI, which is not a very tidy answer, I know, but I think, it would be really great to live kind of very practically in the here and now to make the future that would work for all of us, rather than to live in the kind of dream space that Sam Altman has made, which I think only really works for him, I imagine.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Rachel, you mentioned earlier about, for example, the widening gap, the possibility of widening the inequality gap between the developed and the developing, so-called developing world, when it comes to exploiting AI. Do you see that as, in some sense, an existential risk associated with AI? Or
Yeah, I think Rachel has actually pointed quite clearly to where some of the harms really lie. So there's a e-wasted site in Ghana called Beroshi, which is polluting the local community in ways that are causing untold deaths and health effects. Then we have this increased need for cobalt to make smartphones and laptops, and children in the DRC are having to go and mine for that. And it's causing rampant conflict in a country that should be the richest country in the world, but is the poorest, because everybody's fighting over its minerals to create this electric digital world we so love. But I do think that what is potentially very harmful from this narrative of the existential risk is it's these companies saying, only we can develop this technology. This technology is so powerful, you can only trust us to do it. And that leaves out so many incredible people that are trying and have the skills to build AI technologies that might really help their communities. We're really seeing the effects of this kind of massive disproportion in the ability to create AI, not use it. And there's a very big difference. For the people that can create AI and create frontier models, it requires billions and billions of dollars in computing power, in access to data, and a whole kind of set of skills and infrastructure. And they create frontier technologies and large language models that is in the English language. And so it's only going to serve people that don't speak English to only a very minor degree, or cause kind of levels of cultural homogenization. So I think there's a risk with this narrative that we're not attentive enough to, and that's the risk that we say, well, okay, we'll only leave it in the hands, we'll give even more power to this select few.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. I think we're sort of coming to a point now where maybe we can open up for questions from the audience. You can also pose questions online if you've tuned in online, and I'll address some of these questions to the members of the panel. So maybe we can start with the audience. Any questions? Over there, please.
Hi there. Hi there. I'm Dr. Shyam Krishna. I'm a researcher at the Alan Turing Institute. Something that was said earlier about that pretty much everything happens after the fact, that we work on regulation after the fact, and even metrics, any idea of fairness, transparency, accountability, everything is after the fact. And I see what I would term as a frontier essentialism, as in something has to be always frontier, even the idea that frontier technology has to be there. So what do you think? Sorry? Thank you.
In Siri here.
Thank you.
Answered your question.
Oh my God, is it listening? So are we agreeing with this essentialism, one? And if we do not agree, do we break it up? Do we slow it down? What is the way forward?
Who would like to tell it?
I mean, I can begin by having a go. You know, I think one of the things is like life is really messy and people are really messy, and when we measure things, we don't measure complexity. You know, and so I went to a talk in the summer by Geoffrey Hinton, who invented neural nets. And he said, you know, the reason he invented neural networks is because he wanted to understand people. Which, if you think about that for a moment, is a fairly amazing thing to say. He spent like 30 years in a lab making a thing that was like a brain, rather than talking to anybody. And I think there's something about what kinds of data we respect and we measure, you know, and that homily about what is measured matters, or what matters is measured, or whatever, that actually experience is not measurable, and the idea that we can reduce intelligence to machines talking to each other is not the same as consciousness. And so I think it's you know, to go back actually to what I was saying about religion, we're in this moment where, you know, people want to put their arms around things that are not understandable. We want to rationalize everything. But maybe what we need to do is lean back a bit into the messiness and complexity and not try to measure and understand everything, or do it more sympathetically. And I think there's just kind of one other thing I think that is really interesting in that, about thinking about, you know, there's more and more work happening now around trying to use AI and machine sensors to understand the natural world, which is a whole different sort of intelligence that is all around us, that we've been busy spending the last couple of 100 years trying to tame, minimize, whatever. And I think, you know, maybe we're just getting to the end of that project, and that there'll be a different sort of intelligence that emerges over the next 100 years as we sort of realize that, you know, we are not the answer, or certainly not the only one, you know. So I think, you know, it's all a story, I think, which is maybe not a very data-driven answer. Yes.
Other questions? Lady over there in the grey jacket.
Hi, so I work for a human rights charity called the Freedom Fund, and we wholeheartedly believe that we need people who are impacted by the problem to be involved in the problem solving. I guess it's all well and good that we intend to include them, but the practicalities of it, that, you know, they are facing really near-term problem of putting meals on the table tomorrow and paying school fees or paying for medicine. So I guess, where are we going to find the resources to actually bring these people together, give them the comfort so they're not worrying about tomorrow or next week, to think about the impact of technology, and to, you know, actually have safe spaces where they can convene and talk? I mean, how do we finance these initiatives?
Maybe Rachel A., you might want to speak to that, and then whoever else can follow up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I think there's a lot to be said about how extractive research can be in trying to, in just sort of believing that people are there and available to give feedback on something that really isn't that important within the kind of scheme of what's important in their lives. But I think we might be starting at the wrong place, and I think it would be, there's another question that I want to try and answer at the same time that's in the chat about how can AI be used for socioeconomic benefit. What we really need to do is spend the time and the money better understanding what the problems are, and the technology will come later, and the technology can help solve some of those problems or not, but a lot of these problems we don't understand well enough, and we need to start with what might communities need to help solve these problems, and does technology fall within that suite of offers that they might need, and ideally involve communities in a design process that really kind of forefronts those needs without sort of saying that technology is going to be here to solve it. This is part of the work I'm doing with generative AI, is really kind of trying to think about when and where is generative AI the right solution, because there are times, and I think some of the kind of examples I tried to explain at the beginning, where generative AI is being used for adolescents who might face kind of extreme stigmatization if they would go to a family member or to a clinic and they really want to kind of find out some advice in an anonymous way. I think that those are some of the kind of examples where technology and kind of large language models may play a particularly powerful role, but there are many times where they don't, and we need to be brave enough to say, actually, AI is not solving this problem here, or AI is just being used for other reasons rather than to really help advance inclusion and well-being of people in societies.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a question from the chat. Maybe, Jennifer, you might like to speak to this. So the question is, once something is out in the wild and people start exploring, experimenting, is there anything we can do about the unintended consequences that will inevitably appear? Are institutions or governments agile enough to address these consequences, especially when many countries are involved? And actually, part of the reason why I'm asking you is because I know that there's a lot of work and crossover research with the Future of Humanities Institute and Google DeepMind. I know there's some collaborations, and I know that these So you should do look at the problem of unintended consequences. So maybe you might have to say something to that.
Well, I think what we want to make sure we're building is we want to make sure that you're building frameworks that address the problems at multiple layers. And this is, when you're thinking about regulation and when you're thinking about governance, right? Like you do have, there are things that you can do in advance of the technology going out. And again, like we do think that you should approach the development and the deployment with a certain degree of caution. And then you need to have other layers that give you things that you can do once it is out in the wild, right? And there are different things that will be suitable for each of those areas. So again, we've been advocating, right? Like we do think now, again, like we are getting more and more, maybe it's too soon to call them best practices, let's say good practices around testing that you can do and that you should be doing. And we probably want everyone who's developing technology, at least on a large scale, to be running tests on their, these big models that are going to be then plugged into all sorts of infrastructure across society before you release them to the world. And you probably also want people to be thoughtful about how do you release them to the world, right? Like, do you make them available via certain application, or do you make the code available so everyone can, build on them and reuse it? And again, like that's something that's so powerful and can be so beneficial. But when we talk about things that you build in to some of these models, and again, like, literally things like making sure that your model is not just regurgitating hate speech. Like that's something that people generally agree is good, but when you make something available openly, with the full code and the weights of the model, then people can take that away, right? And so we need to grapple with these trade-offs. And then you need to think again, what do you want after the deployment? Like you need to have mechanisms for people to tell you that there's something wrong, right? To report incidents, to report harm, and then you need to have frameworks that build on what people are saying and reporting to do something about it. And I think some of that includes, again, things like, like there has to be like certain type of accountability and enforcement to say like, well, if a system is being seen to do X, Y, or Z in this domain, we need to do something about it. There needs to be redress, right? And so like, I just think we do need to be thinking about it from that type of perspective, which is like, what is it that you can foresee and what should you do in advance? But there's not everything that you can do in advance. You just can't foresee all of the ways that people are going to interact with the system. I think it would have been impossible, with something like ChatGPT before, a year ago to kind of foresee, right? Like actually hear all of the things that are going to, just happen. But then you need to think very carefully, okay, but then what is that mechanism? What are the channels, and what do you do on a technical level, and what do you have on like a really like accountability and redress framework?
Yeah. Do either of you, Rachel or Rachel, want to speak to that?
I would think actually those two questions are the same question anyway. So to bring it back to how does one anticipate unintended consequences, really there's no unintended consequence. There's just a consequence that someone hasn't foreseen. And I think there's a difference between the two things. And so thinking about how technology teams might foresee consequences of things that happen to people they cannot imagine, in context they cannot imagine. A little bit of that is about power. And so I think to your question, it's not about designing processes in which people are constantly consulted and they have another job to do. Thinking about how data can be differently collected, structured, rather than it being data that happens to people, data created by people, So if we think about, for instance, a lot of the data that goes into large language models, a lot of that is taken out of Common Crawl, which is data that is available online, which, as Rachel was saying, tends to be in English. A lot of it has been generated by people who run the sites or people who edit Wikipedia. And although this may seem like a very specific point, like 1/3 of all articles on Wikipedia have been edited by one man called Steve, right? And if you think about it like that, it's not surprising that we get unequal outcomes in life. And so it isn't just about asking people on the ground, is this working for you? It's about things like, how can we be co-creators of our data? You know, how can we tell the stories about us? We have a piece of work that is looking at how communities might be creators and authors of their own data. I think you're right about redress in a system at the moment. You know, so to go back to the idea of the online safety bill, you would have to know which the platform had caused the harm that you had experienced and then complain to the platform and go through the process. We need regulatory front doors, because the more that people can complain, the more that we understand what's happening. Of course, the people who are most likely to complain are the people with the most privilege. And so we need to make it culturally easier for more people to complain and to be believed when that happens. And I think importantly, we need different people making things. So to Rachel's point, that actually, you know, I'm aware that none of these things are easy. You know, I'm not saying we could launch a program next year and this would all be solved. But it's about how structural inequalities are embedded all the way through every technology that we use. And every time something is digitized, we surrender to that slightly more, you know. And so a little bit of that is digitizing in ways that are more equitable, but sometimes it's resisting it, you know. And to go back to supermarkets, which again might seem very mundane, may not seem very exciting, but if you've noticed, you know, in the Sainsbury's or Tesco's, the self-scan, there's now a little screen, which I imagine within the next couple of years will be turned into facial recognition to help ascertain whether you're old enough to be buying this or not, or whoever knows what else, right? We don't really need that, right? We don't, every time these things are rolled out and the job of the person becomes standing next to the machine to sort it out when it isn't working, you know, we can complain, we can organise. I think worker activism and labour organising is really important. And so I think it's many, many, many things. But, you know, it's not the case, I think, that technology can solve technology's problems. Only we are able to do that.
Thank you. Rachel, did you want to come in, or should we go to another question? Or you looked like you were writing, sort of scribbling.
No, I very much agree with a lot of those points. I think there was a really interesting question in the chat about, do we need to incentivize AI developers to create solutions that can have tangible benefits to the world over? And I think, yes, that's part of it, but I think we also need to allow for other parts of the world to develop homegrown AI ecosystems, because part of the problem is that we're creating new kind of techno-colonialist dependencies where we're dependent on technology developed elsewhere with different value systems on different data that's not always and not often necessary or needed for the problems in this other kind of context. So what we really need is for the technology industry to grow and develop here.
Thank you. Questions in the audience? I'll take, maybe got time for a couple more questions. Would you say what time? Yeah. So maybe you, and then at the front here. First.
A lot of the kind of references for AI jobs, or like even in, you know, my work as a business manager in fashion and retail, is like we can do copywriting or we can do e-commerce, etc. What kind of possibilities do you think are there for AI doing more senior roles? So why isn't my job, for example, as a business manager, there's still going to be a level of emotion, or when I'm looking at strategy, there's a certain level of thinking, and I might miss a number or might miss a forecast or projection. Why can't the AI roles be more senior, and how far do you think it could be before things are being governed from an AI level, and it's not just to make sure no one's using foul language on Google or make sure that no one's misspelling things?
That's an interesting question, because I think years ago the expectation was that AI would sort of replace maybe the more, as it were, menial or manual jobs, but it's looking like able to do a lot of white collar type jobs and sort of more sort of skilled or cognitive jobs, if you like. Who would like to take that question?
I have like a quick answer, which is because it's the people who make the decisions. So it's like the people who make the decisions are not going to say, I'm going to automate my job, right? And one of the most interesting things, I think, is McKinsey. McKinsey are very automatable, and they write a lot of reports explaining how they aren't automatable, but everybody else is, right? And so it's again, it's about who has the power to make the choice, I think.
I think I think it's a little bit, yeah, I think it's not going to work out in linear ways that you might expect. But again, it turns out that indeed, you know, some of these AI systems, they're very good at things like coding. They will do a lot of the work that software developers currently do. And again, at the outset, it would have been easy to be like, well, this, you know, the coders will never build a system that will get them out of some of their tasks. And I think you're definitely going to see a lot of these shifts. And I think the shifts are just like the jobs are going to look different, very different in some instances. And again, it's like I don't think it's going to be like, oh well, it's clear to be to like we'll see net creation or net job loss. It's just going to look quite lumpy. And I think we should just be preparing for that, you know, for it to be a little bit unexpected. And again, some roles, I think it really will depend on kind of the strictures of your role. There are certain roles where, again, like you might have thought, oh, but you know, what about the people who are giving presentations or people who are doing X, Y, or Z? And you're like, actually, it turns out a lot of that, again, can be automated with AI. And the thing is, then there are things where it's like, it can be automated, but will we still like want that, right? Like I think there are just like lots of domains where it will be very easy to automate things, but we will be so beholden to knowing that something was done by a human that we will still maintain that. So again, I think it's going to look lumpy. I think what we're starting to see, for example, in conversations in the creative sector, right? Like there were these massive strikes in Hollywood where writers said, you know, we don't like accept, you know, that again, like we're just going, like we might be replaced with AIs in these parts of the creative process. And you see, it's really interesting. It's like a negotiation, right? It's like a negotiation where like they actually got wins, you know, like they shaped what the sector norms are on applying AI. And it's like AI in some spaces, yes, but in some spaces not, or certainly not without consultation and certain amount of remuneration. And I think we're just going to see this type of negotiation and figuring out across all different types of industries. And again, I think it's just going to be very, very, sometimes like complex.
Rachel, did you want to add anything to that, to what's been said already?
I think in terms of the labor issue, I mean, with generative AI, it's going to not necessarily replace jobs, but make people in those kinds of positions reach new heights of efficiency and productivity. And I think that's what it is largely being designed for. I do think that there is a concern that something that I'm worried about is the onshoring of labor that has been sought cheaply in the so-called global south, and now AI can automate a lot of that work, and companies will not need to necessarily go to places in the global south, particularly if we get to stages with 3D printing and so forth. So that's worrying for me, because that means that there's a different set of policy considerations that we need to be thinking about here if the job market and the labor market is going to look quite different in 3-5 years time, and we don't have highly skilled population. So that's my kind of perspective on this issue.
Yeah. I mean, it occurs to me that maybe that might be some redress in the sense that blue-collar jobs that are typically less well paid than the white-collar jobs might become more valued because the AI systems aren't able to replace those as easily as the white-collar jobs, which was something I think has been a bit unexpected. Another question from the front there, please.
My question is regarding the impact of narratives on our reception and perception of AI. I work in AI ethics and philosophy, and so when I say this, a lot of the responses is, have you seen The Terminator, or have you seen The Matrix? And I understand this because when we have complex topics, often film helps us come to understand it. My question is around when we're also seeing news narratives of scapegoating AI and conversations between big tech and politicians being spotlighted as the most important ones. What is the responsibility of news outlets and filmmakers in shaping how we come to know AI as a technology or as something that's a part of our world?
Yeah. Anybody want to take that question?
I would, so I organised an event yesterday at which somebody, he's called Chef Chowdhury, ran a workshop called Halalograms, which I thought was like the greatest name for anything ever, which was about how Muslim people are represented in movies, right? And how the introduction of automation into movie production was leading to sort of higher levels of stereotyping, which is really interesting, particularly in the context of superhero and sci-fi movies, where it's like you've got algorithmic intensification happening within the context of representing algorithms. I don't know, that's a kind of thing within a thing, but I would, you know, as just a tip to someone doing interesting work around narrative and data, you know, I would look at his work. But I think though as well, like, you know, the thing is, a lot of technology is sort of imaginary in a way, you know, and data is a very abstract thing. And I think, you know, like, I do quite a lot of talking to journalists, and you'll talk to someone for like 3/4 of an hour, and then they will put 2 lines at the bottom of a story. And so I think it's like, is that the responsibility of journalists, or is it the responsibility of, you know, people like us, actually, to be making and creating and telling different stories? And I think sci-fi, like movie sci-fi, is particularly interesting. I did a project about 5 years ago where we published a book of short stories written by women. It was called Women in Event the Future, and so it was looking at the ways that, like, the tropes from Star Trek and those kinds of things have turned into, like, the thing I can't remember what it's called, maybe the communicator, was the model of the Nokia flip phone, like 20 years later. And so I think technologists, to an extent, can only make the things they've already seen, right? So I'm kind of, my brain is slightly broken now, but I'll try and end on a point, which is that it's like, if what we get is generative AI creating more entertainment, what that entertainment will be is an echo of an echo of an echo of a thing that was once interesting, right? And then that will be forming the kinds of technologies that people are dreaming up. So I think maybe it's never been a better time to be a storyteller, and that, you know, absolutely not to feel like AI is taking that away. It's just making more space for genuinely interesting ideas, I think.
We have time for maybe one more brief question and round of answers. Gentleman there, thank
Thank you. Hi. One of my interests in AI is philosophy and theology. And some of the things that we've been picking up is power, trust, and dependence, and how AI is this monolithic figure, entity that people look up to. And part of the sort of formulation in my mind is that our emphasis on ethics in AI and governance stems from our wanting AI to represent a, shall we say, a higher form of power that is inherently benevolent, omnibenevolent, if we will. So yeah, I'm just interested in what your response to that kind of provocation is.
Who would like to?
I'll offer some thoughts. Excuse me, which is that sorry, AI. I think AI is a tool, but I think it's a tool where we do imbue values in it. Like the values of the people building the technology matter, right? Because it's like you can build a tool in one way or in a different way. And so I do think that remains, like that's a longer term issue. This question of like what are ultimately the values that we're going to see realized in this technology like that's a big question, and it is right for us to be thinking about it from both a technical perspective and a philosophical perspective. And I actually have some colleagues. We have some colleagues at Google DeepMind who are philosophers, and they their job is to think about these questions also from this point of view, which is again like philosophically, what are we building? Like what will it look like? What values will we manifest? How do we resolve the tensions in them? Like is it possible to build systems that again like lead us towards broad beneficence, versus not? But there's lots of fundamental issues of basic like philosophy and kind of political science that like politics, small thing that you need to resolve and account for when you're thinking about that. Again, that's just a thought. I think it's worthwhile to think about it. I don't necessarily have any solution.
I have a
Please.
short thing to say, which is, I think people who are building brains are looking for gods, and that it's very easy to say that we can rationalize everything, but I think I said earlier, that it's extraordinary that anyone might think they could not only understand everything but replicate that and have that create new kinds of understanding. There's already more complexity in this room, than anyone can understand. And so I think it is a narrative, a trope, and that I suppose to kind of end where I began, maybe the reason a small number of very powerful people are trying to create different sorts of intelligence is because really they're trying to create new religions that become the thing that happens to us after countries, after states, after politics. And, I think maybe we don't need that.
Rachel, a final word from you, perhaps?
Yeah, I really think this is a wonderful provocation, and I'm going to take this back and think about it a little bit more. I think that we cannot forget that at the time we thought colonialism was ethical. We thought it was a way of being benevolent to the world. And my worry is that we're going to look back in 100 or even just 50 or even just 20 years time and be like, my goodness, what did we miss? And I don't feel like I have the space in my life to be able to do that kind of thinking. So I'm really grateful for that provocation now to have at least a few moments to think about that. But I think those are the kinds of questions that we need to make space for, and we need to make space for the answers to come from the places that we wouldn't traditionally think to go to. So and for those stories too, so I think just thank you for such an interesting question and provocation.
Thank you. So basically, either we want to avoid malevolent gods and have tools that we will use, hopefully, to benefit humankind in all its different diversity, and that's what we can hope. Maybe that this summit may make some progress towards that. But I'd like to thank you all for coming and for your questions and for engaging with this discussion. And special thanks, of course, to my three panelists here for the fascinating and interesting conversation that we've had. So thank you very much to all of you and to our panelists.